when they call us, we can go help them. They're going to say, and I would do the same thing, and I've told their chief the same thing. If something happens in the city where you're going to face some major expenditure cuts, we need to have this discussion again because we need to help each other. But at one point, if one of us can't, that's gonna hurt. So I think it's important we be mindful of that because the cost to go it alone. Let's say we said, hey, we're going to just cut costs and eventually we can't help. Our exposure becomes much higher because of our reliance on them. Now we have a huge risk on our hands. So there's a balancing act also when it comes to deciding what level of service, how you staff, where your people are, that type of thing. That I think we need to be mindful of, but shouldn't be our primary decision maker in how we deploy, but needs to be thought of when we make decisions. So out of this discussion, this group, the section 2, the committee decided they wanted to continue to look to maintain 5 stations from our service delivery model. There is significant discussion, and primarily because of years where we had CPI, we had at least 1 year where it was 0, and several years where it was less than 0.5%, and costs continued to rise at a higher level. So we were put in a position with that CPI plus 0.5% where we really had some struggles and were forced to probably make some big changes to our service delivery model. For 10 years, so this goes back to 2000, the 7 municipalities and the board of directors had made a decision to look at changing that cap from CPI plus 0.5% to CPI plus 2%. And that ultimately passed all 7 municipalities and was in effect, but it had a 10-year sunset. The 10-year sunset occurred.
That was never used.
That's the levy exemption. Yeah. So the 10-year sunset came and went, but the committee's recommendation is to relook at going back to a CPI plus 2, and primarily in the years when your CPI is so low, but your costs, and we run into issues where you have negotiated labor cost increases that are 2 or 3 years out. You have fuel that's not matching the CPI, things like that become a challenge.
And CPI, did you say was 0 for a couple of years here?
I know we had a year of 0 and we had a year of 0.5.
What index do you use?
CPI urban wage.
Urban clerical users index?
Urban what?
Urban wage and clerical users index?
And that's dictated by the agreement, the 7 municipal agreements with regular village. The other challenge that we faced, and I think, well, I know you face as a municipality, is the tax levy limits. Tax levy limits have been state imposed. Let's see here. I'm going to skip to, let's stay there for one. Tax levy limits have been imposed in some way in Wisconsin since 2004. They have changed what they meant, anywhere from a CPI number plus something to now it is net new growth. Net new growth, depending on the municipality you're in, can be, for next year we have one of the 7 municipalities that is a negative, 2 Shorewood and Whitefish Bay, which have a little more generous net new growth in them at, I think, 1.14 and 1.4%. So your ability to raise your levy, if you want to, is different than maybe in some municipalities that have a 0. So raising the levy to pay for, let's call it even a 1.5% increase on costs in some municipalities is a bigger challenge than in others. But again, you're talking finite dollars that you can raise. Something in 2006, the state legislature passed a statute that as a means to encourage other municipalities to look at joint fire and EMS services between neighboring communities. That said, if you have this, you can exempt from your limit the increase for your fire department costs for that year over year. So that is currently available to municipalities now as far as your levy limit. The challenge comes, and I don't want to say that the committee thought this was the this was a way to look at that 2.5% annual increase that the model showed and said, hey, there's a way to fund this that you may not have for other municipal services if you wanted to. So let's go to, I feel like I'm skipping around here. This slide here. So there is a program in the state that some municipalities participate in called expenditure restraint. Expenditure restraint, so how I spent 3 days explaining to our staff this. And so I've tried to make it as, when you don't deal with it every day, it's a challenge. So I may be explaining something you already know, but this is how I tried to explain it to them. Levy is sort of your money coming in your pockets. I think you're all familiar with that. Expenditure restraint, and the levy limits what you can bring in. Expenditure restraint, if a municipality participates in, which Shorewood does, and in fact all 7 North Shore municipalities do, looks at limiting what you can spend. So it's a separate evaluation. But that says you can't spend more from your general fund from your prior, more than that new construction with it's got a 60% factor plus CPI. So that's a more generous number than the levy limit, but it still limits your ability to spend money. And if you do spend that more than that, you lose your payment from the state, which in Shorewood, I think you're close to $300,000 annually from that payment. So you're not talking $10,000 that I'm sure, we could all work together and find that somewhere. But
And it's a
$300,000.
binary thing too, either
You get it or
you don't get it, you get the
All or nothing.
300,000 or you don't get it, it's not a proportion.
Right, so let's just say you say, hey, we're willing to, the fire department needs some money, we're willing to come up with a little bit extra for the fire department, let's call it $20,000 on your levy, and you write that check to the fire department when we send our quarterly bill out. If that throws you over your expenditure restraint, your $20,000 you just thought you gained from your taxpayers to pay for the service, you just lost $300,000. I think we're all going to sit here and say it makes sense as far as a financial move to make as far as a municipality. So that is where we stand. The challenge now is was the legislation, and we've asked for some support and some analysis from the state. Is that one of these unintended consequences of when that legislation was initially passed with the levy limits? Did anyone ever even, was there unintended consequences? Was that intended to be that? Unfortunately, the state is bound in a big budget discussion and is unlikely to want to talk about anything relating to levy limits or state aid to municipalities, is what some of our legislators have told me. So I think right now that's going to be a challenge moving forward as to if we need to ever do something at that point to try to get some legislation passed or get clarity as to what the intent of the legislation was at the time.
And that doesn't even take into account if we did want to take advantage of using the higher levy limit, what that politically does to us as a village by having one department.
Right. Yeah, and
That's our discussions we have all the time.
right. And that's a discussion. So that would, to exceed the levy limits, requires a resolution or an approval of each of the 7 municipal governing bodies. Doesn't mean you necessarily need to do it in your municipality, but you would need to authorize that. Even so let's say, we'll pick out Whitefish Bay. Let's say Whitefish Bay said we need to get some more levy for the fire department. And they were the only one of the 7 municipalities that needed to do that. The other 6 governing bodies would still need to say, yeah, we agree with the concept. Doesn't mean you need to do it, just you agree with the concept. It's an interesting way that the legislation was written, because Whitefish Bay may be the only one that really uses that action to increase the levy. So coming out of that section, one of the things that the board wants to be sure I do and the staff does is to talk to groups, the village boards, the common council in Glendale, other stakeholders to understand that there is a process to look at this, and these are the issues at hand. Because as budget season is coming, it's something to be out front of and look at years forward when people are asking questions about sustainability and services. That's something that is important to your citizens that you represent, so you're informed of those items also. So under facility and capital, as I said, our 5 facilities and our rolling stock, unfortunately, fire and ambulance equipment is not cheap. So there's a large capital investment for the service. We have 5 facilities. 2 of them were built 1995, so the consolidation or since then. 3 of them were owned by the municipalities or still remain owned by the municipalities. The Whitefish Bay Station is owned by the Village of Whitefish Bay, and the Shorewood facility is owned by the Village of Shorewood. We have brought in and are still looking at reports from engineering and architects, looking at the facilities, saying, hey, we need to understand what our long-term costs are here. Where are we going? Because it's a significant investment from the municipalities. So in general, I think this board and some of your predecessor board members have been through the discussion on the police station facility next door. I think there's more information to come for the fire department side, but just to put it out there, something probably needs to be done. It's an old facility, and whether that means it is updated or it is significantly replaced, I don't know what that answer is yet. But there's some significant challenges in that building. And that is out there. The Glendale and Whitefish Bay Station, when we had a consultant look at them, they came up, and we knew this, with recommendations for updating that we have been looking at and evaluating for a long time. It's not a discussion that I don't think has not come up before. It wasn't a surprise. But from a financial planning standpoint, that discussion needed to occur so we can look out moving forward. We have the bond debt that is paying for the 2 stations that have been built since the consolidation will come to an end. In other words, it'll be paid off about 2022. So we're starting to look at how we move that forward because there is a need to address these other 3 buildings. They really, frankly, they haven't been addressed since 1995. Most of them stand as they stood and look as they did in 1995 right now, with some minor changes. Our rolling stock, so our vehicles, thanks to the support of the boards like you, the Common Council, our board, we, in 2008, undertook a major rework of that program, and it is well funded. It meets our needs, and we feel very comfortable where we're at right now. I remember walking through this in 2008, and I couldn't say that. And since 2008, with everyone's support, we've been able to resolve some significant challenges we had there. So the plan moving forward is for, I'm doing a similar presentation to all the village boards and Common Council in the North Shore over the next couple weeks. Continue to answer questions, because I think as time comes, these issues are going to come up. And it should be the first time elected officials have heard that. I think it's important that you understand it. President Johnson, who's the president of the Fire Department Board this year, does an excellent job representing you, but a lot of these issues come back at your level for discussion and voting also. And it's important to have everyone educated and understanding what we're doing out there. We'll continue to evaluate the facilities. I think from my personal standpoint, this facility next door is going to be one of our priorities. And part of that issue is because as the police department moves to their new facility this week, right, Pete?
That's correct.
That building will become half vacant. And I think there's some decisions that need to be made on that and how that is handled. And I know the village is interested in those since you own that building. And we also need to continue to look at that expenditure restraint issue. I think, unfortunately, we have very little to no traction on that because the state legislature has other priorities, I guess at this point, that they're dealing with, and it may come up once this budget season and some of the other hot topics have been moved on. And maybe we can get some traction there. So I'd be open for any questions. I appreciate your time.
I have a couple. The OPEB issue, or you refer to as the stabilization fund, and the projection moving forward through
2030.
2030. Is that internally done, or is that, did you have an actuarial study?
So there's an actuarial study that we're required to do,
Yeah.
and they look at it from long-term liability. And then we did an internal analysis of what the actual cash flow on that was. So if you look at our actuarial study, if you look back, I think 6 years, that actuarial study came back with about a $30 million liability. With some of the changes in benefit levels and plan design and employee contribution to some of the costs. Our most recent